Okay. I'm going to now endeavor to do the most boring talk in the history of FCC because we are going to talk about standards. A scintillating topic if you've ever read one. Standards tend to be very precise documents that describe how things work so that vendors and developers and people building systems, if they all write their code to perform the same functions, then all the products should work well together, right? So Ethereum has some of this already. It has the yellow paper. It has the EIP process and the ERC process that produces various standards. There are a couple of things it doesn't have, right? Particularly around a way of driving in things like privacy and confidentiality into the public chain specifications. There are things that larger companies need that they want to see in it, and for larger vendors and larger adopters of the technology, they need something that looks a bit more like what they're used to getting from, Intel and Oracle and IBM than what they find in the community, right? So why standards development? It's a place for members to collaborate and contribute, but the real reason behind this is network effects, right? It's not particularly helpful if your tools don't work together, right? Because if I am building, say, an administration tool or a monitoring tool or a network analytics tool, I want to be able to plug it into any VM, right? And I don't want to have to hardwire against them. And by the way, if you're a purchaser of a tool or a user of a tool, you want to know that you can mix and match in your stack, right? And to be able to mix and match in your stack, you need to have well-defined interfaces so that you can plug out one piece and push in the other piece, right? In addition, if you have good standards, you can start to do things like certifications. And you can start to certify how well products comply with standards. And there's some of this already in the Ethereum community in terms of some of the test suites that are available, but the bar for some of the more risk-adverse organizations to adopt our crypto ecosystem technology is a little bit more rigid than that, right? There have been reports in publications like CoinDesk and elsewhere about major investment banks wanting to trade cryptocurrencies, right? In order to do that, they are de facto going to have to run Ethereum nodes, right? To some extent. Their IT architecture committees will look for all sorts of things that really aren't there today when they select which VM to run, right? And so to expand the ecosystem, beyond the early adopters, we unfortunately need some things that are really, really boring, right? And standards being a really, really good starting point for figuring that out, right? So one of the reasons why we created the EEA is because what standards work that there is being done in Ethereum, and there's quite a lot of collaboration around best practices and protocols and what have you, is being done on the public chain. And what was being done in private chains was really code-based fragmentation. People would literally download Geth and then change the code base, right? Quorum being a very sophisticated example of this, right? And that means you run the risk that tools don't work together. You run the risk that private chains won't be able to talk to the public chain, right? You run the risk that CIOs and IT architecture committees will choose Hyperledger Fabric and go with IBM because it's safe, right? And so we wanted to create the EEA to avoid that and to ensure interoperability, to ensure that vendors could produce robust products that larger, more risk-adverse organizations could adopt more easily, right? Now, I think it's important to note that in my view, the EEA is not really about private chains, okay? In my view, and a view that is certainly gaining thought leadership inside a consensus, we will have a public global chain that interconnects many subchains. There are certain pieces of information about me, like my medical history, I really want on a global cryptographic distributed ledger, right? And the reason why I want that is if I move, I don't want to lose all of my data, right? I want to be able to choose to share things between my doctors, right? So I really want that sitting on the public chain, right? But I want it sitting on the public chain with a whole bunch of standards and compliance features built into it so that I know that people I don't want to see it can't see it, right? And that's what people inside of the Enterprise Alliance worry about, right? They worry about things like confidentiality and privacy and permissioning, right? But ultimately, there is a growing belief, at least inside of my organization and within the board and the technical development teams inside of the EEA, that this really all should be interconnected through the global chain, right? And so we end up with these private permission subchains that can interconnect through a global chain and potentially do that cross-protocol. And if we do that cross-protocol, then we're going to need even more boring protocol standards to make it all work, right? So the flip side of all of that is this is Ethereum. So if it's not open source, if it's not member-led, if it's not community-led, it's going to fail, right? So the EEA started out in life very much as a membership-driven organization, bottoms up, no real instruction on what to do. That delayed some progress during last year, and so we brought in a senior executive director and put in place more technical management in order to increase the cadence of development. And I have a slide on that later. But the goal is not to build a different Ethereum. The goal is not to fragment Ethereum. The goal is to gather a set of requirements that aren't currently being pushed in the public chain open source community and create an open source community focused on that will drive it back through the EIP process. So it's about community, it's about driving maturity, and it's about being able to provide a versatility that extends beyond the current earliest of adopters, right? And so the EEA is built in a way that if we show up at a large investment bank who wants to build a crypto trading desk, they look at something that starts to look a little bit like the credibility of what a large traditional IT vendor or a large traditional technology standards organization would look like, right? This is, I believe, really valuable for the broader Ethereum community. If we want to change the world, we need to change all of it, right? And that is going to mean changing a lot of the legacy world too, right? So there needs to be some part of our community that provides that interface, right? Now, there are going to be parts of our community that aren't really interested in that interface. If you look at any sort of ecosystem or stack or technology platform, there's many, many bits that don't get used, right? How many people here have used Microsoft Word as a word processor, right? So how many people have used more than 20% of its features, right? But it's a small subset that actually use all of everything. So it's perfectly okay for big portions of our community to not be interested in how do we have something that appeals to traditional IT organizations. But it's also important for everybody that it's there and we have that capability. So one great thing is Ethereum is getting adopted everywhere, right? The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance is now over 400 members. It's really focused deeply on technical standards, but has a series of working groups that I'll come on to that are working up at the application layer and at a higher level. But this is actually, again, I think tremendous for the community and for the ecosystem, in part because it is the largest, largest consortium of commercial organizations in blockchain globally, by some material margin, and certainly the fastest growing. And it's a very diverse group. All over the world, very wide variety of industries are participating, right? So we have the smallest companies of the world, the biggest companies of the world, governments, technology vendors, financial institutions, all coming together to increase the adoption of Ethereum. So there is a question around how do you actually do this, right? And so the first issue is understanding what are the privacy, confidentiality, enterprise scaling requirements that are actually needed, right? And to have a group of people that are good at going and figuring that out, right? Because there's no point in writing a specification if it doesn't solve a problem, right? The second thing is we need to be able to communicate this. And the common language that most of us speak most of the time are block diagrams, right? With arrows and interfaces pointing at each other, right? So we need to be able to ground a common understanding of what this looks like. This is one of the most educated audiences in the world. And I bet if we had everyone come up here, and because it's such a small crowd, we could do this if we want to, we would not all be able to draw an EVM. And those of us who could would draw it very differently, right? Because there isn't a common set of understanding beyond some beyond some slightly esoteric documentation about what one of these should look like, right? And that may work for the core development community. That might be okay. But it's a barrier to entry for a large number of other people and organizations, right? Who need much more traditional block diagrams like you find in classical technology white papers, right? And so what you don't want to do is write reams and reams of specification that doesn't solve a problem. And so to get to a spec, you need to have done the first two things. And then you need to get to code. And so there are a number of the blockchain startups inside of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance will have specification, Enterprise Ethereum, specification compliant virtual machines probably within weeks of the specification being released, right? So the EEA has put together a very clear technical development process, which is based about market requirements, like what people need at a user level, technical requirements, how do you build the system, gathering a group of advisors to advise on that, and then developing the standards and pushing it out. And so this is pretty normal, actually, for how industry consortiums write standards and specifications. What we have done, and this is perhaps one of the most significant, and for a developer community, perhaps one of the more boring slides possible to create, what we have done is try to put in place a much more structured approach to how the EEA operates. So we hired a gentleman called Ron Resnick, who had done a lot of the work around Wi-Fi and 5G standards. He was an Intel executive that then went into the WiMAX and the Wi-Fi Alliance and various other places. And he is someone who runs. He is someone who runs standards organizations. That's what he does. He's done it for the last 20 years. That's just what he does. And he's put in place a team of 9 or 10 people that he's hired that are there to administer the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance entity and organization. It's not to do the work. The work needs to be done by the technical steering committee, which is volunteers, and by vendors and technologists, and with the user inputs from organizations that want to build on top of this. But we have a 10-person, very professional management team ensuring that we achieve the outputs that we say that we're going to do, which is primarily around specifications and standards, as well as membership engagement, education, and events, etc. So in addition to trying to define a set of additional standards around Ethereum for doing effectively private chain transactions in a way that is public chain compatible, there's a series of industry user groups around things like digital identity, insurance, energy, etc. And this is important because if we want the legacy world to shift to our ecosystem, we're going to need to show them how, right? We're going to need to give them an instruction manual and a map. Because when you go down the crypto rabbit hole, it's not easy, even if you're really trying to understand it, let alone if you're working in an organization that's slightly resistant, right? So the idea of having these use case and application layer user groups is to allow for the diffusion of knowledge and the development of standards, right? So there are already a great deal of industry standards out there. There's, you know, XBRL for financial interchange, right? In the old days, there was the EDI. There are already lots of standards out there, right? And what we're going to need to do at the application layer is make sure that there are, just like there's the ERC20 token contract standard, that you have something similar for what is an insurance policy, right? If we really want to have insurance on the Ethereum blockchain, we're going to need that, right? And if we really want to have the ability to actually put like life insurance for, you know, $5 or $10 million on the Ethereum blockchain, we're probably going to need some big life insurance companies to help us figure out how to do that, right? Because they understand how the underwriting and the policy stuff works, right? So this is a layer this is the layer at which those types of discussions should be happening. And then further down the stack, we have the specification piece. So this is the part that's saying, look, we've got the Ethereum roadmap, and we want to add into it transaction confidentiality, smart contract permissioning, et cetera, all the things that you need if you want to have your multi-million-dollar life insurance contract sitting on the Ethereum blockchain, which I think probably we do. Then we're going to need to layer in some specifications for how privacy and management works, right? And so that's being done at the specification working group level, right? So the principal piece, when we launched the EEA in February last year, our goal was to get the spec out in a year. And we haven't quite done that, but we're not that far off. So the first goal is to not be too late shipping the spec, right? And I think we are in good shape to deliver on that quite quickly. The second is, one of the challenges that you face when you try and run larger value transactions in complex multi-party processes, and I don't mean just shipping a bunch of Ether to Coinbase, I mean trying to do something like a complex insurance process, is you need to start to get companies to do things like create IP agreements, right? And NDAs, because they're going to want to keep it behind the curtain and make sure they're not losing their valuable product, right? While they're collaborating on figuring out how to do it, right? And so the EEA is a really powerful infrastructure for doing that for two reasons. One, it's building a test net, so a test net of private chains that allows organizations to stand up applications very quickly. And second is because it comes in, it has built into it the necessary antitrust, confidentiality, and IP clauses necessary to do this in consortia. So what that means is EEA members can collaborate with each other through the EEA without needing to go to their legal to get a partnership agreement signed with the counterparty, right? This is going to save years of development cycles in terms of building large-scale applications in Ethereum, right? It's because you can lose 2 to 3 months per project on trying to figure that out, and sometimes a lot more than that, right? There'll be quite a lot of work around just attending more conferences like this, participating and driving user education. We have a whole bunch of more traditional organizations that now want to use Ethereum, and we need to be presenting and communicating to them in a language and a style they're familiar with, and so the EEA is taking on that as part of its mission. And over time, start to develop certification programs both for technology and for developers so that, again, to drive that adoption, right? If I'm a large company with 10,000 employees and I want to hire a developer, I'd like to know what a good developer is, right? So an EEA certified development program would be a nice thing. I'd like to know that the product, when I install it, is going to work with all the management tools, work with all the financial reporting tools, and everything else, right? So there's a lot that can be done around certification. And then the most important thing is be part of the community. Be an active member of the community in an open source way that bridges between the legacy world and the new world. So, the EEA is on a mission to increase its value to members, to provide a knowledge base, to provide for collaboration, and to provide for deep connectivity, right? And a lot of progress has been made over the last 3 or 4 months around this, and I expect to see a great deal of activity over the next 6 to 12. So I'd encourage anyone who has never looked at the EEA website to go there. It's not very expensive to join. For startups, it's very low cost. And find meetups. There are meetups all around the world for the EEA. There's a large one in London, a large one in New York. I suspect we will have a growing one in Paris. And remember, and let me just go back to what I said before. If the Ethereum community really wants to change the world, it's going to need to change all of it. It's going to need to if we really want to service the needs of the 7 billion people on this planet and beyond, then we really need to interact with the institutions that are serving them already, right? At the same time, I am a big believer in starting companies and starting over and starting with a fresh piece of paper. But even if you're doing that, you need a venue in which you can communicate with your customers frictionlessly, right? And understand what their needs are. And the EEA is here to help achieve all of that. So with that, we have 2 mics, and we have a small group, so we can either do the let's all draw EVMs on the whiteboard challenge, or we can do some Q&A. Did that spur any thought or interest in this group of people that could lead to a question? Please. We have a second mic as well. I don't know if we can do the, all right. Who is going to be our mic? Oh, yes, look at this.
So,
oh, the person with their hand up got preempted by the mic helper. This is great.
So the slide with the different industries, how did you choose the different industries you want to tackle?
We did not choose different industries we wanted to tackle, they chose us. So
Okay,
people show up, right? So car manufacturers show up, airplane manufacturers show up, right? They're showing up, and they're calling up and saying, this Ethereum thing, we see it taking off, we see how many developers there are, there's a surprising amount of interest in tokens. Thanks, VJ. You're helping my ratings. We paid VJ to come to this, literally. What's that? No, he works for Consensus. So the demand, the membership from the industry participants is literally people showing up. But one interesting thing is the increasing interest in tokens by very traditional players. How to tokenize supply chain, how to tokenize international payments, international trade, bills of lading, insurance policies, etc. But it's people showing up. Increasingly now, if we see a pattern, right, what we should be doing and what we are getting to is, if 3 car manufacturers show up in a month or 2, we should probably go talk to the next 10, right? And that's why we put in place the team as marketing and PR and membership outreach to be able to go and do that. Cool. Next question. Except for it won't go on the stream. I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So it's about the membership. You say it's very cheap for startups. How cheap it is, and how come you have only 400 members right now?
So 400 members does make it the largest blockchain consortium in the world. Go Ethereum. And remember, it's only a year old, right? I mean, this is fairly unprecedented in terms of membership growth. I think for small organizations, like up to 25 people, it's something like $3,000. And we're trying to figure out how to deal with highly qualified individuals as well, which we haven't quite figured out yet, but we will.
I was wondering, I was kind of intrigued about the thing you mentioned about sort of lowering the compliance and legal sort of friction for members to work with each other. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could go a little more in depth about that. Like, is this something that members subscribe to when they sign up, or how does that work exactly?
Yeah. So the EEA membership agreement, when a company joins, includes antitrust language, IP language, and confidentiality language. So if you want to work in a consortium between 4 or 5 organizations, once you get past a certain scale, right? Like if you're 3 people and the guys down the road want to work with you, you typically just sign a basic NDA and you're done, right? If you're trying to work with Intel or you're trying to work with Citibank, that's not sufficient, right? Because their legal teams get worried about things like antitrust provisions and IP leakage, et cetera. So the EEA is structured to allow its members to operate in consortia with each other on blockchain problems, right? So they don't. So if a subgroup wants to spin up a project, right, like to do a test for, go back to the one I was talking about, medical records, right, on an EEA test net, they can just spin up a working group to do that, and they inherit, right, just like in object-oriented programming, they just inherit all of the protections that their baseline membership agreement has in it, right? So there's no need for them to go and set up a sub-consortia and go and create the documentation to go and do that. And if you've ever had to try and create, you know, that type of documentation, you know how long and expensive it is. So I think it's an undersold benefit of the EEA, and it'll become much more prominent when we have the testnet up and running. So it's going to go like this, isn't it? We're going to do a big mic circle.
One question about the business model of the EEA. Is the EEA just a kind of organization that provides standards, that companies like Consensus, for example, will implement and will sell to customers?
So yeah, so the EEA is a not-for-profit. It's a Delaware 501(c), which is the same thing as the Linux Foundation. So there's a, in Europe we have this idea of foundations. In the US, you have this idea of not-for-profit companies. So the EEA is structured legally very similar to the Linux Foundation. It's a 501(c), which means it's a not-for-profit that can engage in lobbying activities, unlike a 501(c), 501(c)(3), which can't do that. And because of tokens, and the reason why that's actually important is because of tokens, there's a need to engage with regulators, and there's a fine line between what's educating someone and what's lobbying, right? So we're set up as an organization who can do both. But it's a not-for-profit. It's a very, very standard not-for-profit used in the US technology industry. So there isn't a business model to the EEA. I mean, the way it's able to pay its staff is by having members renew and pay their fees each year, which means it needs to be doing enough for the members for it to be worth the money.
Thank you for the talk. Are there any deployed private network facilitated by EEA already, or do you see them coming in 2018, and what are the specific cases that you can talk about?
So the EEA is trying to build a private subnet. In fact, it's got one that's sort of in beta, but it hasn't been exposed to the public yet, to enable this type of consortium collaboration. I mean, if you think about where the sort of, I guess Vlad's finished, huh? Should I just do it all over again? For the second act. So I think when we have the testnet up, you're going to see different activity. If you look at the trajectory of how private enterprise-style deployments of Ethereum have developed, is it started off with people doing really primitive POCs, like the UBS Smart Bond, right? Then you got into people trying to tweak Geth a bit here and there, right? And so if you look at and Clearmatics has done this in a closed source way. Obviously, Quorum came out a little later. You started to get a combination of open and closed sourced Ethereum clients that would provide degrees of privacy, permissioning, and confidentiality. Block Apps is an early example from Consensus, Nuco, etc. Right? You then had Quorum come around, which had much greater thinking about the issues because it came out of financial services, right? And so one of the things it had is it had real user requirements baked into it, right? And so Quorum's been adopted in a number of instances. I mean, one project that is broadly public that we worked on is the Santander Payments Network, which is sort of a better version of Ripple built on Ethereum. I would expect, since JP Morgan built it, they have quite a lot of it running somewhere, though and there are other instances of it going up around the world. What we think this idea of having the standard get published in the coming months is really going to be an inflection point, because if I'm an IT organization, right, like a CIO of a large company, the fact that the standard's there and a bunch of vendors have signed up to support it suddenly de-risks Ethereum for me relative to Hyperledger Fabric and R3 Corda, right? And if you look at the enterprise market today, that is the market, almost in its totality. So I think there's three parts. Sorry for the complicated answer. There's three parts to it. It's the EEA itself hosting testnets. There's the evolution of where we've gone through in the adoption. And then there's the prediction of what will happen to adoption when we get the spec and the upgraded clients out. Next question. Oh, I think we're done. Wow. That's excellent. Well, thank you for coming. Sorry for those of you who didn't get to catch it. I am told the first 10 minutes was the most riveting presentation ever delivered on blockchain.